Chris Thomson, the Scottish Affairs Council for the Scottish Government, North America.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that really kind introduction and making me feel more important than I really am. So the first thing I've done today is to show you what a Scotsman keeps in his sporran. It says speaking notes. But I want to thank not just Tom, but I want to thank everyone who's come here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I know that sometimes it's difficult to put diaries together, so I appreciate the perseverance of friends around the table. A bit of background about me. You've heard a little bit about what I've done. I've been here in the States almost a year now. I'm based in Washington, DC, and I'm getting about where I can. I've been to 10 states in 10 months, and I plan to get out to a few more in the future. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm from West Central Scotland, from a semi-rural area not too far from Glasgow, which is Scotland's biggest city. I was educated at the University of Glasgow and then did postgraduate studies at the University of the West of Scotland. I've worked in the private sector, in banking and bookmaking, before I moved into the public sector where I worked in criminal justice, mental health and in prisons before I moved into government. And some might argue that that's a great background for working with politicians. My personal focus in government has largely been on economic and social policy, and I've always had a really strong interest in international relations because Scotland's economy relies heavily on our trade that we do with other countries, particularly with the US. So when the opportunity came to come to the US and represent the Scottish Government, I jumped at it. The Scottish diaspora in the US, which you represent a part of, has been estimated at anywhere between 5 and 20 million, depending on who you ask. That means that there are at least as many Scots in the US as there actually are in Scotland. So this is an important job. I've been asked to talk a little bit today about what's going on in Scotland just now. I think a lot of the time when we are in the US and we think about Scotland and we imagine Scotland, we imagine a Jacobite Scotland where people are dressed a bit like me just now. We've got a bit of blue face paint on and we're probably killing English people. I've not done that for a while, I promise. So I consider myself a patriotic Scot. And I use the word patriotic deliberately. George Orwell, the author of 1984, considered patriotism to be a love of a particular place and way of life. No desire to force it on anyone else. And that was in opposition to nationalism, which Einstein famously described as the last refuge of the scoundrel. So I refuse to be a scoundrel, I'll be a patriot. And I think that's something that's shared with many people in the US. I've been struck since I've been here with how strongly people feel about their country, and it's a really inspirational thing. I'm really proud of Scotland, and I'm proud because it's a small country which has given a lot to the world, but also because there's so many great things going on just now. And I'll touch on both of these things as I speak. So what's going on in Scotland just now? Well, there is a constitutional elephant in the room, which I'll come round to. But let me pick up on some of the other interesting things that are happening just now as well. It might be a surprise to some people, but Scotland is actually a real player in the space industry. From a population of about 5 million people, we produce 21,000 graduates per year in space-related subjects. The James Webb Telescope, which you may have seen in the media recently, replacing Hubble and sending us back pictures of the universe we've never seen before, it was actually developed with some of the expertise from Edinburgh's Astronomy Technology Centre. The University of Glasgow leads the world in the development of gravitational wave research, and elsewhere in Glasgow, a cluster of companies produce more small satellites than anywhere else in Europe. We've got multiple satellite launch facilities in development around the north and west of Scotland, including horizontal launch at Prestwick, which happens to be the only place in the UK that Elvis ever set foot. It's its claim to fame. And we've got vertical launch at Sutherland, Shetland, Argyll, and in the Western Isles. This means that, probably unique in the world apart from Florida, you can design, launch, monitor, and evaluate space systems all within 50 miles of your home location. That's just about unique in the world. So space isn't usually what you think about when you think about Scotland, but it's getting there. But coming back down to earth, literally, our food and drink offering is the heart of our economy and our export centre. Scotch whisky is our biggest export, and It's bouncing back from being caught up in recent UK-US tariff disputes, which we're very, very pleased about. And we're up to about 4 bottles of Scotch whisky being exported to the US every single second. So, yeah, thank you for your appetites. So, what's important about that is not just that it's a cultural export, it's a financial export. The whisky industry in Scotland supports thousands of jobs in rural communities, jobs that wouldn't exist otherwise, and communities that might not exist if those jobs didn't anchor them. So it's hugely important for us to make sure that we support the Scotch industry, not just because we really, really like it. And I do love whisky, but man cannot live on whisky alone. I've tried. We also, if anyone likes a gin and tonic, we make about 70% of the gin in the UK comes out of Scotland as well, because we have got distilling expertise. Unfortunately, I'm driving today, so I can't avail myself of too much whilst I'm here this afternoon. Because we're quite a small country, our food and drink offering is not about quantity. I mean, Scotland's small enough to get lost in some states in the US, it's ridiculous. People drink our whisky because, and I may be a bit biased, it's the best in the world. We also have some of the best seafood in the world, something which we share with the Chesapeake Bay, a love of seafood. But salmon, langoustines, scallops and prawns thrive on the rugged, beautiful coastline of the west of Scotland, and they're enjoyed around the world. But we don't rest on our laurels. Those natural advantages are one thing, but even the ancient arts of farming and distilling, we don't stay still forever. So we have leading companies in Scotland developing vertical farming, looking to use state-of-the-art technologies to cut resource, water and land use and create more efficient crops. We also have multiple distilleries experimenting with creating hydrogen from wind power, using the hydrogen to heat the stills, and using the stills to make the whisky. So you can have net zero whisky. Imagine the joy of being able to drink a whisky and save the world at the same time. That sort of expertise and that innovation would not be possible without highly skilled people. Scotland's renowned famously for its education, some of the oldest universities in the world, and I'm a Glasgow graduate, so I'm very proud of that. Our list of inventions could take up the rest of my speech, so I'll just pick a couple of highlights. Antibiotics, television, radio, telephone, the refrigerator, steam engines, tarmac, golf, and more recently the toaster, the refrigerator, the MRI scanner, and even the world's first cloned mammal, Dolly the sheep. So Scotland's got a long history. There's a great book called The Scots Who Invented the World, and it's not far wrong. According to recent figures, nowhere in Europe has a higher percentage of the population educated to advanced qualification level than Scotland, which surely places us amongst the top in the world. 3 Scottish universities were recently ranked in the top 200 in the world, and an alumnus from the University of Glasgow, who I had the pleasure of meeting recently, was jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry last year. Professor David Macmillan, who won the Nobel, is the 6th Scot to win a Nobel Prize since 2015, and the 16th overall. That's no mean feat for a country with about 0.06% of the world's population. I think we're punching above our weight. So why do we have that expertise in education? It's because we recognise the importance of access to education, regardless of race, gender, colour, creed, or financial ability, from preschool to day one in your job and beyond. And that's not the heart of a political programme in Scotland, that's the ethos of the country, and that's stayed that way for generations. Personally, I come from a working class background. Without Scotland's commitment to free university education, I'd have never been able to afford to go to university. I'd never have been here, and I'd never been able to speak to you people today. So it's something that I'm personally deeply grateful for. Now, all that brain power in Scotland can't just be spent on whisky, although, I mean, there are worse uses. One of the things we're turning that brain power to is climate change. It's one of the greatest challenges of our time, and we've seen, sadly, across the US this summer, climate wreaking havoc and costing lives. It's only getting worse, and we in Scotland recognise that we've got a role in combating this. So we've got what we call a Just Transition programme. We already have the world's largest offshore floating wind array, we have the world's most powerful tidal turbine, and the world's most ambitious legally binding climate goals. We're a country which can provide 100% of our electricity needs from renewables already. and which takes our responsibilities amongst the family of nations seriously, including holding a UN climate change conference, COP26, in Glasgow last year. Our ambition is to use the natural advantages we have in Scotland, and we have 25% of all Europe's offshore wind potential, to create an economy where we are net zero by 2045, where we produce hydrogen, and where we are able to supply that to our neighbours across Europe, which would remove some of the energy reliance they have on less savoury regimes elsewhere in the world. That's a powerful vision, and one we've been sharing with a number of states here in the US since I've been here, helping them plot their own ways towards renewable energy security, sharing our route to this point, what we've learned, and thinking about what partnerships we can have in the future. So, we are a net exporter not just of whisky, not just of seafood, not just of other things, but ideas as well. I think our strongest export, and you might agree with this, historically has been our people and our culture. Scottish culture is an immensely strong brand of which we're very proud. Traditionally it's seen through whisky, tartan, bagpipes, and the work of our national poet Robert Burns. I will eat my kilt if no one here has sang Auld Lang Syne at some point. But we are a nation of innovators, and we don't rest on all the things that we've done in the past. So let me touch on modern Scottish culture and what that means. We're much more diverse than people imagine. And as we've welcomed people into our country, we've massively engaged with other cultures as well. You're as likely to find someone in Glasgow eating a chow mein, a curry, or a carbonara as you are eating haggis. The mythical deep-fried Mars bar is just that, although any enterprising fish and chip shop owner will make you one for the right price. Scotland has in Edinburgh, happening right now, the world's largest arts festival. It happens every year. It's a genuine treat for those of us who live in Scotland to be able to welcome people to the city. It's a city usually of around 500,000 people. For the month of August, it becomes a city of 3 million people from around the world. And it's a pulsating throng of music, theatre, comedy, and literature, including the world-famous Edinburgh military tattoo. And one of the things that we've been doing in the US since I've been here is actually partnering with colleagues just across the water in DC who want to create a Washington tattoo, which we're really, really excited about. Scotland is also a serious film destination. The recent series of Batman films have been shot in Glasgow, doubling for Gotham. We've got the new Indiana Jones film, filmed in Glasgow as well, and our film studios are literally booked full for years with Netflix, Amazon Prime and Marvel productions. Scottish actors like Alan Cumming in X-Men, Karen Gillan in Guardians of the Galaxy and Jumanji, and Brian Cox in Succession are lighting up the big screen. And shows like Outlander, which everyone loves, show off some dubious history, but some amazing scenery and handsome men in kilts. So having covered the slightly more glamorous bit, I'll touch on something that just about everyone I've spoken to today have asked me about. What's next for Scotland? What's the constitutional elephant in the room doing? So I'll give you a potted history of where we are in Scotland first, and then I'll set out what might happen and what the positions are. So Scotland has its own parliament and its own government, which is who I work for. That's an elected body, 129 members of the Scottish Parliament who are brought in on a mix of first past the post, so representing a constituency and some representing larger areas. The idea for the system is that there should never be an overall majority where one party can steamroll their agenda through the country. But for the last 8 to 10 years, the majority in the Scottish Parliament has been for parties who support independence for Scotland. So it's actually almost broken the system, the support in Scotland for these parties. We were in 2014 only the 3rd country in the Western world to appoint a gender balanced cabinet. That's been maintained ever since. We always seek to have an equal number of men and women in the cabinet. And we also have a fairly high profile female First Minister who I was honoured to host in Washington DC earlier this year. Now that's what the Scottish Parliament does. But there's another Parliament as well. We don't just have one Parliament. There's a UK Parliament which also has powers over Scotland. So Scotland elects 59 members of Parliament to Westminster in London. The current makeup of these is overwhelmingly again in favour of parties who support independence for Scotland. Of that number, 44 are from the Scottish National Party, 6 are from the Conservatives, who are the party in power in the UK, 4 are Liberal Democrats, 2 are from ALBA, Labour have one and there's 2 independents. So you see in both parliaments where Scotland is represented, there's a significant majority in favour of parties which support independence. And in Westminster, where Scotland has 59 MPs, the overall count is 650. So Scotland's votes are not typically decisive. And that has led to claims from some in Scotland that there's a democratic deficit. Everyone in Scotland could vote for one party and they could be easily ignored because of the volume of people in England and Wales. And that brings us to the question of the constitutional future. As a civil servant and as a diplomat, I'm not here to provide any particular political view. In fact, I am barred by contract law from ever expressing a political view, which is fun. My job here is to talk about the facts and the policy position taken by the Scottish Government. That position is simply that the Scottish Government in Edinburgh has a significant amount of powers over economic development, education, health, social policy, land and justice. The UK Government in Westminster holds many of the other levers and many of the more significant levers: defence, international trade and fiscal powers. The fiscal powers are, of course, a key battleground for anyone. It was the Clinton campaign in the early 90s who said, it's the economy, stupid. And it is, it's the economy. So the Scottish Government currently gets its money to support our economy year on year from the UK Government. It can't borrow as other governments do, it can't raise monies and it can only raise certain taxes. It can't save money for future use if it doesn't spend as much in one year of things. It has to give that money back to Westminster at the end of the year. The Scottish Government's position is that working like that is stupid. Working like that constrains decision making, you can't make long-term plans and you can't make investments. Moreover, the Scottish Government contends that the UK Government doesn't represent the will of the Scottish people, and that's exemplified by things like the UK's exit from the EU, which Scotland voted significantly against, and the austerity policies, cutting spending of the last few governments in Westminster, things that the Scottish Government opposed but could do nothing about. So the Scottish Government, in short, thinks it could do better for the people of Scotland if it had all of the powers. But the UK Government, on the other hand, thinks that the rest of the UK and Scotland are, to use their phrase, better together. They know that there was a referendum on independence in 2014, in which 55% of the people who voted to remain in the UK. Their view is that the matter should be considered settled, at least for now. The contention of the Scottish Government is that there's been substantial change in the UK since then, not least that withdrawal from Europe. And that's worth noting because in 2014, one of the big arguments against independence was if Scotland becomes independent, it will be thrown out of Europe. It will not be a European Union member anymore. Of course, 2 years later, in the UK-wide referendum, Britain voted to throw themselves out of Europe, and Scotland was taken out whether it was independent or not. And that's made a big difference to some of the people in Scotland, particularly EU citizens who lived and worked in Scotland. And the economic consequences of Brexit have perhaps been muddied by the COVID pandemic, which has struck everyone's economy. But the reaction of markets to Brexit, which was an immediate 20% slump in the value of the pound, suggests that the effects were quite real. And in Scotland, which has relied more heavily on EU citizens for significant economic sectors such as agriculture and tourism, the effects were disproportionately harsh compared to other areas of the UK. And the Scottish Government has said that that decision and the consequences that it's had is a reason to have a second referendum, because the fundamental position of the relationship of the countries has changed. And to support their views, the Scottish Government is currently publishing a range of papers outlining their policy positions. What would an independent Scotland be? What would it do? And recent papers have shown that small independent nations in Europe, of which there are a number, tend to fare better than the UK on many measures, on productivity, on GDP, on health, on education. And the argument of the Scottish Government is that Scotland would be better able to meet her own needs with independence and perform better. So, that, with a little bit of complexity, is the starting point. On one side, the Scottish Government thinks that they could do better if they had all the powers of a sovereign state. On the other hand, the UK Government says that Scotland is better off economically with the UK retaining those powers. So what happens next? Both governments are at loggerheads. How do we resolve this? There are a few ifs and buts here, so bear with me. In the settlement which afforded Scotland its devolved government just now, the constitution of the UK was reserved as something that only the UK government could deal with. So if something might impact that constitution, only the UK government can legislate. since a referendum on independence would potentially impact that, then many have assumed that only the UK can give permission for a referendum. However, the Scottish Government is challenging this and have taken a case to the Supreme Court of the UK, which will be heard in October. And if the Supreme Court finds in favour of the Scottish Government, then we'll move immediately to plans for an independent referendum in October next year. And I anticipate move straight into the fun and games of campaigning from both sides. If it's decided that Scotland can't hold the referendum without permission from the UK, then the government in the United Kingdom have already said that they will not allow that to happen. So that would create a position where the Scottish Government would have to find other ways to push for independence. So it'll be an interesting few months, and we'll know in October what the next steps will be. It's quite complex, but in those few months, those ifs and maybes will be settled. There'll be decision points, and the future of Scotland will become more clear. By the end of the year, we'll know if there will be a fresh referendum next year, and if not, what the Scottish Government intends to do about it. And I'm happy to pick up on that in any questions people have later on. But I want to make a couple of things really, really clear, because independence is a big issue. It's a very divisive issue amongst people. But I think what is really important is to know that the things that won't change, regardless of independence. So whether Scotland remains in the UK or becomes an independent country, our relationship with the other nations that make up the UK should remain really strong and really friendly. Economically, we rely on one another, but much more than that. The bonds we have of friendship and family across the UK are sacrosanct, and no one wants to change that. Regardless of what the future holds, we in Scotland will continue on our route to net zero. We will cherish our culture, we'll continue to strive for academic excellence and innovation, and we'll look to retain our relationship with global partners, whether as part of the UK or as an independent nation. In particular, we're determined that Scotland's relationship with the US will remain strong. Now, we will always be part of US history. Scots were amongst the first European settlers here. Scots helped build the White House. We helped create the US Navy. We fought in armies that helped create the republic that you enjoy today. And we helped shape American commerce and industry through men like Carnegie, Buick and Forbes, not to mention the 30+ presidents who claimed Scots or Scots-Irish heritage. The US is our biggest single trading partner and biggest investor outside the UK. And around 5,000 US students come to Scotland to study each year. The exchange of ideas between academia and between companies helps drive industry and innovation on both sides of the Atlantic. And we want to build on that. I'm a huge believer in the power of relationships. You might not expect me to go the British ambassador, but we do actually get on very well. And I think she's right when she describes, as she often does, diplomacy as a contact sport. It's important that we meet, we talk, and we understand each other, that we form strong relationships. And I want to offer everyone here a relationship as well. Not just a relationship that allows you to contact me or my team wherever we can be of help. You can take that as read. I want to offer you something a bit more. The opportunity to be part of the Scottish family. Because it's my view that you can be Scottish by birth, you can be Scottish by descent, or failing either of those, if you're unlucky, you can choose to be Scottish. And if you do, you're welcome to join the extended family of Scots around the world. My role here, the role of my team in the US, is to strengthen Scottish-US bonds still further, ready for whatever awaits Scotland in the future. It's why I spend my time travelling the country engaging with policymakers, politicians, chiefs of staff, businesses, diaspora groups, educators and diplomats from around the world. It's why I'm here to talk to you today. And it's not just me who thinks this. The first long-haul trips that were made by Scottish Government ministers after the pandemic hiatus were our Cabinet Secretary for Constitution and External Affairs, Angus Robertson, coming to DC and New York in April. And our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon's first overseas visit in 2 years was to DC in May. We brought our most senior politicians to the US, not for fun, because it's not fun. We brought them here to engage with politicians across both sides of the aisle, to talk about our ideas for the future, to further our economic relationships, support our diaspora, and showcase our culture. We wanted them to amplify our message that our doors are open, our welcome is warm, even if the weather isn't. And if you share our values around justice, compassion, and integrity, then you're welcome not only to do business with Scotland, but to visit, to study, to live. You're welcome to be a Scot wherever you're from. It's those junctures that we seek to find, those junctures where our history, our culture, and our common values meet, where innovation, academia, and industry work together, and where modern Scotland can meet modern America. Thank you very much. I believe I'm now at the mercy of the room for any questions that anyone may have. So, for those who couldn't hear that surprise, I didn't mention Adam Smith. Adam Smith, also a Glasgow alumnus. So Adam Smith, the author of the book The Wealth of Nations, probably the most famous and important economic text in the history of the Western world. I didn't mention, but that is interesting. Adam Smith would have been 300 next year had he lived. The University of Glasgow are working really closely with us and with partners to celebrate his 300th anniversary next year. We are looking to work with American University to do some lectures, do some events at the embassy, but we're also talking to Harvard, Northeastern, Chicago, and various other universities across the US to bring a celebration of Adam Smith and his work to the US. So I expect through the society we'll get some information to you about what the university is doing. That will include online lectures, online reading groups, the launch of an Adam Smith summer school at the University of Glasgow, and executive retreats to study the work of the great man. So thank you for prompting me. So what is my plan? Good question. I come from a mixed Scottish-Irish background. So there's a fair bit of Irish in me. McVeigh's and Banks from Cork. There's Thomson and there's various others. I'm wearing Hebridean granite tartan in my kilt today, and that's extremely significant because that's what my wife wanted me to wear for her wedding. I'm also wearing a clashing tie, and anyone who's snobby about tartan, forgive me, but I think it's fine. I'm wearing a Thomson tartan tie as well.
Did I understand you to say something about a tattoo for Washington? Could you talk a little more about that if I got it?
Yeah, you got it right. So we were introduced to a really inspirational Sergeant Major in the US Army Old Guard, a fellow called Mark Riley, who is an exceptional musician and educator and has performed and written music for fife and drum bands and pipe and drum bands around the world for the last 20 years, and he recently retired this summer from the US Army. His vision has always been to create something for the US like they have in Edinburgh. I don't know if anyone's been to the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, but it's a spectacular, stunning event where you have military bands from all around the world and great performers from all around the world performing in Edinburgh Castle Courtyard. It runs through the festival through the month of August every year, and it's a truly global and amazing event. And worth noting that it's worth around £100 million a year to the local economy. So we got talking to Mark and got interested in what he was doing, and we spoke to the economic development section of Washington DC, and they said initially, well, that sounds like a nice thing to have. And we told them how much money it was worth, and they said that sounds like a very nice thing to have. So we've been working with them. This year they had a dry run being a pun I did not intend, at a winery. Certainly not a dry run. They had their first in-person event at a winery in Virginia, which went down really, really well in April. And we brought some of the performers to DC later that week to perform for our Cabinet Secretary at the Washington DC Tartan Day events, which we held in the Metropolitan Club in DC. And we're looking to work with them possibly later this year to put on another event, and we'll be supporting them to do events around the Tartan Week next year. Their overall ambition is to have a full-scale military tattoo in DC, or potentially at another historic location in the DMV, to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Republic, which I think would be spectacular and absolutely appropriate given the role that Scots have had in the creation of the US.
Any more questions? Are you familiar with a chap by the name of Pennington that came over to the colonies in 1760s, 1770s? And he became was invited to become the president of Princeton College, then now Princeton University. He brought with him his entire library and he had the records of the 13th of the Declaration of Our Road. If you compare our Declaration of Independence to the Declaration of Our Road, there's some similarity in the language.
Yeah, that's a great point, a fascinating point, and that's why in the US every year, the 6th of April is designated National Tartan Day by Presidential and Senate Declaration. The 6th of April 1320 was when the Declaration of Arbroath was signed, which, as you say, was Scotland's original Declaration of Independence. And it took the form of Scottish clan chiefs and nobles basically writing to the Pope to say, stop the English bothering us.
You know which one it was?
Yeah, James the third. Fourth.
Every day is a school day. So you're right, there's been noted similarities between the US Declaration of Independence and the language used in the Declaration of Arbroath. And I've forgotten the numbers, but there are a number of Scots by birth and Scots, those of Scots descent, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and a number who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I think more than any other individual country.
Do you know who was part of this class? Jefferson, Madison, those guys who wrote the Declaration.
I will be claiming that in future speeches.
Good on you, Nate.
This is on different, totally different topic. I was in college in 2014, I tried to find out if there was any sort of relationship between the number of holes on the golf course and the number of shots in the fifth. Talking to a kid at St. Andrews University, he didn't know. I'm sure that was his information. I'm thinking about the evolution of golf and how
I'm not sure, my favourite hole on the golf course has always been the 19. Yeah, I'm usually dog tired from the 120 strokes it took me to get there. I think the gentleman just behind you was going to ask a question.
Actually, just to add to how the Scots built the modern world, I lived in Philadelphia for 10 years. Part of my family came from Philadelphia has a very unique city hall. I don't know if you've ever been to Philadelphia, but it is.
Will you speak up, sir?
I'm sorry. It's unique because there are passageways underneath. It's built on 4 piers, okay, and it's a rather large structure. It's unique in its day. And what's interesting is that if you're moping around underneath the building, hopefully it doesn't come down on you, you look over, there's a plaque, and there are numerous architects that designed this, and not surprisingly, each one is a Scot.
Yeah, and it's incredible the influence that Scots have had on things like the architecture and the design of parts of the US, and particularly places like Philadelphia. I was lucky enough to be there in, I think it was January this year, celebrating the anniversary of Carpenter's Hall, which was designed by another Scot, another famous Scottish architect, which was a real pleasure, and a real pleasure to see Philadelphia and learn a bit more about the Scottish connections that it has.
Chris, my name is John Magley. I'm also a graduate of the University in Glasgow, but this is the Strathclyde time. So I really enjoyed your speech. I wanted to ask you a policy question. It's a serious policy question. What would the policy of an independent Scotland be to an independent nuclear deterrent? And would they still expect to rely on the United Kingdom's nuclear resources in its defence?
That's a great question, thanks. And for anyone who didn't hear, the question was, what would an independent Scotland's position be on an independent nuclear deterrent? And would Scotland expect that the UK's nuclear forces would continue to be part of the protection of Scotland? Now, I don't want to get ahead of what my First Minister says, because she can probably hear me. But there will be policy papers from the Scottish Government published later this year which will cover this in great detail. But what's already on public record, when the First Minister came to the US in May, She spoke at the Brookings Institute, which is a famous think tank, and she gave a speech, and the questions afterwards included questions about that, and then we spoke to the Washington Post. Then the Washington Post asked about it. Then we spoke to Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi asked about it. Then we spoke to Wendy Sherman. Everyone asked about it, right? So the First Minister is on record saying that in independent Scotland, that the policy position of the current administration is that they would not want nuclear weapons in Scottish territory. They would want to be NATO members, and those two things people have said before are not compatible. But actually, only 3 countries out of the NATO alliance host nuclear weapons. That's the US, the UK, and France. So every other member can be a non-nuclear nation. So their position is it shouldn't be difficult for Scotland to do that. The nuance of the question was that the UK's nuclear weapons are actually hosted in Scotland, and if an independent Scotland didn't want to have them, what would happen? The First Minister has said publicly that an independent Scotland would go into negotiations with the United Kingdom and be a responsible partner. And it wouldn't be take your nuclear weapons the next day. It would be talking about a long-term handover when the facilities were available for that to happen in England, probably somewhere around Portsmouth where they've already got submarine bases. I don't want to speak for the UK government, but that would be the position of the Scottish government. It would be a long-term handover with a lot of discussion around how to do that safely. And in terms of the nuclear deterrent being used to protect Scotland, again, the First Minister and our Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs have said that Scotland would want to be a NATO member immediately upon becoming independent. So we would anticipate that the same mutual defence principles apply to any NATO country would apply to Scotland.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
I have one question for you. Is it true that when the Scots asked what he was wearing under his kilt, he wouldn't tell you, unless you asked him, and he'd be glad to show you.
What I would say is, in a country as warm and sticky as this, one would be foolhardy not to wear something under one's kilt.
Just a little bit business. I forgot to congratulate Cheryl and Linda that's really helped us get this food served and our drinks. We thank you very much. Thank you, boss, for the food. The upcoming is the Kirkin at Christ Church. That'll be September 25th. The picnic will immediately follow that at Robert and Mercian. That's the same day, the afternoon. The annual meeting in October to elect the officers officially and members for 2023. They got 2032 on here. There'll be, I'll give you the State of the Union address at that point. The annual dinner will be held on November 19th. That's a Saturday. And then the Christmas in St. Michael's Parade, early December, we don't know the date. Everyone, I hope you had a great time, and thank you so much.